everyone, welcome to the video for questions and answers of social neuroscience. So I received two questions of yours. I put those questions together because I think that they are very much related. They are both about gene expression and gene variants. So let me read them out. The first one is, how are individual differences in gene expression related to aggression? So does a low variant mean that they are highly sensitive to aggression, or they are less sensitive to aggression? And then question 2 is, can you explain again the topic of human oxytocin receptors that exist in two polymorphisms? There was something going on with having GG, but what does it mean if a person has GG? So I looked back at where they belong to. So the first question is actually about aggression and the MAO-A gene. And this was briefly discussed in chapter 1, but more thoroughly discussed in the chapter about aggression and immoral behavior. And then question 2 comes from the chapter about love and relationships, about oxytocin. There is actually the human oxytocin receptor gene, which may have confused the person who sent me the question, because the oxytocin gene, it's really about a gene. So they are both questions about genes and both questions about variants. So I think that may have been the confusion here, that it's both about genes, and genes can, there can be some sort of polymorphisms, which means that there are several variants of a gene. So let's look at that. So we have that MAO-A gene. This was referred to as a warrior gene. So the idea is here that it can have two variants. They only discussed the low variant in the book, which they called the L variant. I assume that there will also be a high variant, where you have some sort of high variant, because if there's a low variant, there's probably a high variant. That was not discussed. What they told us in the book is that the low variant makes you more aggressive. So that's why it's some kind of warrior gene. You display more warrior-like behavior, which is more aggressive usually. Then there's also this oxytocin receptor gene, which also comes in different variants. And here they did discuss all the variants. So they said that there's an A variant and a G variant. The A variant was a long variant, and the G was some sort of shorter variant of this gene. And then because you receive one from each parent, you can have A, can have a G. So that means that you can have either AA, AG, GA, or GG. And then obviously the AG and GA, they are just the same because it means you have one A from either of your parents and one G from the other parent. Then in the book they described that if you have the GG variant, so if you received both a G from your dad and a G from your mom, that makes you more socially sensitive, and that means that you have higher empathy on several questionnaires. So this is the first thing that you need to know. So these variants can give you different traits. So it can kind of like have influence on your personality. You can become more or less aggressive and more or less socially sensitive. This can be because maybe you it's interacting with some kind of hormones, or it's interacting with like a receptor, like the receptor gene, and therefore you have different type of traits. Then what was discussed in the book that might have made it more complicated is that these genes that you have, these specific variants that you have, can interact with the environment, and then you get into a gene-environment interaction. So they discussed one in the book where they said that this L variant, that for L variant, the children that carry this variant are more sensitive to maltreatment. So if you write this out with arrows, it makes way more sense. So I did that here. So it means that if you are maltreated in your childhood, this leads to more aggression when you are an adult. And the idea here is, what they say is, if you have this L variant as a child, so as a person, that you are more sensitive to this. So it means that especially in those carrying this L variant, if they are maltreated, they get more aggression. They didn't say that if you have a high variant, maybe this relation doesn't exist. It could be, but it could also be that this relationship is just stronger when you have this L variant in you. In any case, it makes you, in this case, more sensitive to maltreatment. And if you see maltreatment as aggression, it could mean indeed that the question in the beginning, is this L variant more sensitive to aggression? In this case, yes. So it's more sensitive to if they are maltreated. So if aggression was put onto them, they are more likely to develop aggression as an adult. Okay? Then the other one was the oxytocin receptor gene. And here what they said in the book was if you have this GG, you are more sensitive to childhood neglect. So this was a little vague in the book. They didn't say much about it, but they just said that you are more sensitive. So this is probably also a gene-environment interaction, where what they say is that if you are neglected in your childhood and you have that GG variant, that you are more sensitive to this. So you have more negative outcomes. They didn't specify what outcomes, but it could be more anxiety as an adult, or more problems, more maybe more depression, all sorts of things. But all the negative outcomes of neglect may be more detrimental for people that have this GG variant. And it could be because they are more socially sensitive, like we saw. So these people have a certain personality due to this gene that makes them more vulnerable to neglect in their childhood. Okay, so these are gene-environment interactions. It always helps if you draw them out. So if you have difficulty with imagining these, then just try to draw them out, and remember that gene-environment interactions always mean that you have a certain gene that makes you more sensitive or less sensitive. So they can either be a buffer or an accelerator of a certain environmental effect. Okay, I hope this was useful and that your question was answered. If you have any more questions, or if you have any follow-up questions on this, just send me an email, and I'll see if I can do another video if necessary.